Imagine a company so powerful it had its own army, not a security team, not private contractors, a full military force of 260,000 soldiers, twice the size of the British Army itself. This company collected taxes, fought wars, ran courts, printed its own currency, owned entire cities. It controlled half of all world trade, and it answered to no government on earth. This was not a nation. This was not an empire. This was a corporation founded by a group of London merchants in the year 1600, given a piece of paper by Queen Elizabeth II, and handed over the next 250 years the most powerful position any private company has ever held in human history. This is the story of the East India Company, and how a business built to sell spices ended up ruling 200 million people. In December 1600, a group of English merchants petitioned Queen Elizabeth I for a royal charter to trade in Asia. Spain and Portugal had monopolized the spice trade for a century. The profits were extraordinary. Pepper, nutmeg, cloves, spices that cost pennies to source in Asia, sold for fortunes in Europe. The merchants wanted in. Elizabeth granted the charter. The company was born. Its full name was the Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies. It started small: ships, cargo, warehouses on the Indian coast, trading posts called factories in Surat, then Madras, then Bombay, then Calcutta. But here is where the story starts to change. Every time the company set up a trading post, it needed to protect it, so it hired guards, then soldiers, then built forts around its warehouses, and then the Mughal Empire began to collapse. In 1707, the great Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb died. The empire he left behind fragmented almost immediately. Regional powers fought each other. Political chaos spread across the subcontinent. The East India Company looked at this chaos and saw opportunity. In 1757, a company commander named Robert Clive led a force of just 3,000 soldiers, mostly Indian troops in company uniform, against the Nawab of Bengal's army of 50,000 at a place called Plassey. The company won through a combination of superior tactics, artillery, and the strategic bribery of the Nawab's own general. And with that victory, everything changed. The company was no longer just trading, it was governing. Within 8 years, the Mughal emperor had signed over the right to collect all tax revenue in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa to the East India Company, one of the richest regions on earth, handed to a corporation headquartered in London. A Mughal official named Narayan Singh reportedly asked at the time, "What honor is left to us when we have to take orders from a handful of traders who have not yet learned to wash their bottoms?" That question had no good answer, because the company's army kept growing. By 1800, it had 200,000 soldiers. By 1803, 260,000. Using that force in less than 50 years, the company subdued and seized an entire subcontinent. Bengal fell, then Mysore, then the Marathas, then the Sikhs, then Punjab. By the mid-1850s, the East India Company governed 2/3 of the Indian subcontinent. Not Britain, not the British government. A corporation, run by a board of directors answerable to shareholders in London. Now let us talk about what company rule actually looked like for the people living under it. The company's primary interest was profit, always profit. When it took over Bengal's tax collection, it extracted revenue with ruthless efficiency. Local farmers were taxed on their land whether the harvest was good or bad. When they could not pay, their lands were seized. In 1770, a famine struck Bengal. The harvest failed. People starved. The company continued collecting taxes. An estimated 10 million people died in the Bengal Famine of 1770, roughly 1/3 of Bengal's entire population, and the company's revenue collection barely paused. Meanwhile, the company's own officials were becoming extraordinarily wealthy through a practice called private trade, using company resources, company soldiers, and company infrastructure for their own personal commercial ventures. Robert Clive himself returned to England with a personal fortune estimated at 300,000, the equivalent of tens of millions today. When questioned by Parliament about how he had accumulated such wealth, he replied, "I stand astonished at my own moderation." The company's governors in India lived like kings. They built palaces, they held courts, they received tribute, they were answerable to nobody nearby. And the board of directors in London was 6 months away by ship. The corruption was so extreme that the company's own executives became known by a nickname in English, nabobs. A corruption of the Indian word nawab, meaning prince. Men who had gone to India as modest clerks and returned as fabulously wealthy aristocrats, buying country estates and seats in Parliament. For 100 years this system ran, extracting, taxing, expanding, enriching, and then came 1857. In May of that year, Indian soldiers, called sepoys, serving in the company's army, mutinied. The immediate trigger was a rumor about rifle cartridges. New cartridges issued to soldiers allegedly contained grease made from cow and pig fat, offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers who had to bite the cartridges to load their rifles. The company denied it. The soldiers didn't believe them. But the cartridges were just the spark. The fire had been building for decades. Resentment of company taxation, resentment of land seizures, resentment of cultural insensitivity, resentment of being governed by a corporation that saw the people of India primarily as a revenue source. The mutiny spread beyond the army. Civilians joined, princes joined. It became a widespread uprising against company rule, what many Indian historians call the First War of Independence. The company suppressed it, brutally. Villages were burned, people were executed. The reprisals were widespread and savage. But the mutiny broke something that could not be repaired. The British government looked at what the company had done, the corruption, the famine, the military mismanagement, the brutality, and made a decision. A corporation could not be trusted to rule an empire. In 1858, Parliament passed the Government of India Act. The East India Company's territories were transferred to the British Crown. Its armies were absorbed into the British Army, its directors were removed, and in 1874, the East India Company was formally dissolved. It had lasted 274 years. It had controlled half the world's trade. It had an army bigger than most nations. It had governed 200 million people. And it had done all of it in the name of profit.
One historian called it the supreme act of corporate violence in world history. A private company that used military force, political manipulation, and systematic extraction to strip an entire subcontinent of its wealth over 2.5 centuries.
The East India Company is studied in business schools today as a case study in corporate growth and market expansion. Perhaps it should be studied differently, as a warning about what happens when a corporation is given enough power and not enough accountability. Because the lesson of the East India Company is not how far a business can grow, it is how much damage a business can do when nobody is watching. Next time on The Buried Record,